We'll give it one more minute. While we're waiting, I hope everyone is signed up for our Colorado Pragmatic Research in Health Conference, or CopperCon, next week. I'm so excited about the wonderful lineup of speakers we have coming to talk about assessing research impact, the use of system science, an emphasis on complexity science, as well as dissemination and implementation of pragmatic methods. So if you are not yet signed up for CopperCon, we do still have some space available. We will be doing it as a hybrid event, both virtually through our Learning Times platform and limited availability here at the Anschutz campus in the Education 2 building. And if you are interested in signing up, you can just let Jordan know in the chat here, because I think our regular registration channels are generally closed. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to Accord's Qualitative and Mixed Methods seminar mini-series. If you're not familiar with Accords, we are a pragmatic research unit here at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. We conduct research in real-world settings to improve healthcare and outcomes by providing a multidisciplinary collaborative research environment. We have faculty and staff from many different departments on campus. We offer strong methodological cores and programs led by national experts in dissemination and implementation science, quantitative and biostatistics methods, qualitative and mixed methods, as well as mobile health and digital health methods as well. We offer consultations in team building for grant proposals, mentorship training and support for junior faculty, including those on career development awards, as well as extensive educational offerings such as the seminar series and CopperCon. And did I mention CopperCon? I think I did. And for today, our capstone event for our Qualitative and Mixed Methods series is Dr. Allison Jaure from the University of Sydney, who's a professor of public health there, who will be presenting on reporting and presenting data from qualitative and mixed method studies. Dr. Jaure is a principal research fellow at the Sydney School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. She has experience in patient-centered outcomes research in chronic disease, particularly chronic kidney disease. She developed the consolidated criteria for reporting qualitative health research, or COREC. I was so excited to hear about this just now. It's really the primary guideline in reporting qualitative methods, as well as the enhancing transparency in reporting the synthesis of qualitative health research, or NTREC. Which are both endorsed as key reporting guidelines by leading journals and by the International Equator Network for promoting the transparency of health research. I'm so delighted to welcome you here today, Dr. Jaure, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Bethany, and thanks to Jordan and Sarah and the Accords team for the opportunity to speak on this topic. And also thanks to everyone for accommodating the time difference. I'll just share my screen. Yep, it's 7 a.m. here, so I think it's probably late afternoon for you there. And I do remember visiting Colorado or Denver a few years back, and it would have been amazing to be able to do this in person, and did a bit of a spontaneous side trip to Winter Park, which I very much enjoyed. So hopefully next time. So in this seminar, I'll be talking about, as Bethany mentioned, reporting and presenting data from qualitative and mixed method studies, but the primary focus in this seminar will be on qualitative methods. So there'll be 3 topics that I'll cover in this session: methods of analyzing qualitative data, reporting qualitative data and demonstrating rigor in the process, and presenting qualitative data in a visual manner. So firstly, just running through an outline of methods of analyzing qualitative data. So just, first principles, what the aims of the analysis are in qualitative research. It can be quite challenging because you're weaving kind of copious amounts of data and trying to present it in a kind of succinct and compelling way. I'm not sure what for many of you what your target journals are, but I generally publish in clinical journals where there's a word count of say 3,000 to 4,000. So it can be quite challenging to kind of condense everything into that word count. But the aim of it is to really capture the whole breadth and depth of the data that you've collected and ensuring that it's presented in a very comprehensible, insightful, trustworthy, compelling, and an original way. And particularly if you're going to be writing for clinicians or policymakers, that how you present the data is in a way that is also actionable. This may sound obvious that it answers the research questions, but I have seen studies where the findings are not quite congruent with the focus and scope of the research question. The aim is also to describe a particular maybe social phenomena that you're looking at, or to develop a theory or explanation. And I like to provide some metaphors with what I believe qualitative research is about, and just keep this in mind during the analytical process. So the first one is kind of the iceberg, and qualitative research really delves deep and goes into what we cannot see up, above the surface. It delves deeper below the surface to uncover people's hidden sort of values, their core beliefs, their priorities, and their preferences. And the second one is a snapshot from some Aboriginal artwork. And this is usually done to convey things like kind of cultural or community values. So again, qualitative methods can be used to paint a picture of what the community or people's values are. And thirdly, it can provide people with a voice. So particularly when you're doing research with, say, for example, patients where they're not given when maybe in clinical settings, they may not feel very empowered to speak openly and honestly for fear of jeopardizing, say, the relationship with their clinicians. Qualitative research can give people a safe space to kind of articulate their open and honest views. So the principles of the analysis to align with the topic and scope of the research question, considering the audience, whether you're writing for, say, clinicians, policymakers, or sociologists, that can sort of change the way you may approach the analysis. It can be done concurrently with data collection, so you can see perhaps what concepts or themes you may need to further explore with participants, or it may inform how you sample participants. It's generally inductive because it's usually used to kind of look at topics where there might not be very much data. And also in this approach, the researcher is an active participant. And this is a table kind of to compare the quantitative and also the qualitative approaches to the analysis. So with qualitative, generally it involves reading of the transcripts or the data that you collect, maybe observation notes or even kind of documents, making memos, conceptualizing the data, grouping them into themes, and identifying any patterns or kind of relationships among the themes. It involves a process of coding. The software that's generally used, so this could be the one that I use, HyperResearch or NVivo. There are quite a few available that do similar things. It's used to store, label, retrieve data. It really facilitates the data collection. Unlike with quantitative, where it kind of produces a kind of result, here, it's only facilitating the process. It's about providing a narrative and a rich description, and to capture the breadth and depth of the data collected, and the emphasis is on transferability of the findings or the concepts or the theory that you might develop, so that the reader can determine whether the findings sort of resonate with their population or with their context. Coding is kind of a fundamental part of the analysis. It's a starting point for most forms of data analysis. It's a process of defining what the data are about. So you highlight segments of words or paragraphs. And in terms of what can be coded, it depends on the study design. It could be the setting context of the study, the definition of the situation, events, perspectives, activities, for example. So by definition, codes are kind of sort of a label that you give to a descriptive or information compiled during a qualitative study. So you attach these to yeah, it could be, the length can vary. You might be coding a particular word, a phrase, a sentence, even whole paragraphs. So I thought I'd just throw in a bit of an interactive activity here. And if you can, and we'll just use the chat box. So this is just a snippet of a transcript from a study that was conducted with around 30 women about pregnancy and chronic kidney disease. And there'll be lots of examples here from chronic kidney disease because 90% of the work that I do is in this area. So women with chronic kidney disease have a high risk of sort of fertility problems. And also if they do fall pregnant, they're at higher risk of pregnancy complications. So we conducted an interview study to just understand some of their perspectives, the challenges about pregnancy in chronic kidney disease. And I thought I'd just ask you to have a go with a bit of coding and to read through these paragraphs and see if you can identify some code. So this is about developing a label or a short descriptor to reflect what the participant is feeling or what their values are, what their goals are. So I'll give you maybe a minute or so, and if you can, if you're happy to jot things down in the chat. And what I'll try and encourage you to do is come up with a phrase. So expand it more than one word. So we've got hopelessness, lack of hope, to try and capture both the feeling or the value as well as the context. Body as a ticking time bomb. Yep. Disappointment, lack of, yep, good. Maybe we'll wait for a couple more. So, yep, body image. If you can expand on that particular phrase to try and also capture what their thoughts are around body image. Good, living on edge your whole life. Uncertainty, yes. Hopelessness about the future, good. I can already see some recurring ideas, which is good. What I might do now is present perception of future happiness as being related to the body. So when developing concepts in the beginning, I mean, it's a process of kind of coming up with the initial concept and then refining it. So it's kind of a phrase that really captures the participants' feeling and also as much as possible the context. So these are just some examples of the themes that were identified, and this is presented in a thematic schema. So from this study, we identified a number of themes where women described the sense of devastating loss, a bodily failure, having guilt, but also this whole experience kind of reorienting their focus in terms of valuing life and being sort of grateful for things that have happened, looking at the positive side of things. And also they describe the sort of what I call it decisional burden, and encapsulated the themes of having to kind of rationalize the consequential risks. So things like decisional ownership, some women talked about, pregnancy being sort of over medicalized, where it should actually be their own sort of life decision. And some women also talked about strengthening resolve to have children. So I thought I'd just present here some examples of how you might be able to present or describe in a short phrase the concepts. And what I generally suggest is, for example, if you're presenting in an abstract, the list of themes, when one reads your list of themes and also the sub-themes, they should be able to put themselves in the shoes of the participants and kind of have a sense of exactly what they're going through. So it's really an iterative process where you identify concepts, then you sort of group similar concepts together, Then you separate them, bringing them into a category or a theme, and then identifying the relationships and patterns. And this can be quite an iterative process involving reading, rereading, and discussion with other members of the team who are involved in the analysis, and really trying to generate that sort of analytical, theoretical set of findings. There are three main approaches. So the most common, I would say, is the thematic analysis, and this is usually inductive, derived from the data that you've collected. So you don't have sort of predetermined themes beforehand where you're trying to code the data into those predetermined themes. Rather, it's inductive. You identify concepts as you go along, and you can do constant comparisons within and across sources, meaning the interviews, focus groups, documents, and the output is generally a set of themes that are full of meaning. Content analysis can be a confusing one because I've seen this done in both a deductive and inductive approach. But mainly I've seen the deductive approach where researchers may code the data into codes that have already been identified. And it's generally used when there's a meaning denominator. For example, if you're coding maybe media articles to particular topics. And that's when you might want to use your inter-rater reliability. Then there's a more specific form, the grounded theory analysis, and this is used when you're doing a grounded theory study, and they use processes such as open coding, axial coding, and selective coding and memoing. But I won't go into these in too much detail, given that the seminar we're trying to focus more on presenting the findings. This is just to provide a bit of context and background. So when we're talking about theory, theory is defined as an organized, coherent, systematic articulation of a set of ideas or concepts that are communicated as a whole. So theory can be used to direct your attention in a particular area that you're wanting to explore, to provide a framework, so health belief model, for example, for thinking about a problem. It may guide the study design, and I use the word guide rather than sort of direct. And you don't want to use theory to kind of box a study in. It's more about guiding the study design, perhaps providing suggestions and ideas for what areas to look at in the study. And again, it may be used to guide the data analysis. So it's usually, it's better used as a tool to interpret the data, not to be used as a kind of lens that may restrict the way in which you analyze. And in terms of you developing theory, this is about looking at individual insights, bringing them together, and kind of highlighting the wider relevance. So ensuring that the transferability of the concepts, or maximizing transferability of the concepts to other settings and populations. So I'll just go back. There is no kind of one single correct process to do it, but I just thought I'd present very quickly the way that I approach the analysis. So firstly, I would read the transcripts and familiarize myself with the data and make some memos or just notes about some initial concepts, similar to kind of what we've done in the chat box. Then I'd start listing my ideas. Some people may prefer to map, but I generally try to list, and I'm starting to think about grouping the similar concepts together. And again, it's best to involve more than one person in the coding process, particularly someone else who's read the transcripts or who was present at the data collection, so that you can ensure you've captured the full range and depth of the findings. It's conveyed in a way that is very reflective of the data. And when looking through the data, to keep focused on, it's really about elucidating the things that are beneath the tip of the iceberg, drawing out the attitudes, the values and beliefs, not so much the actions of people, for example, how they may be taking their medications, but really the underlying reasons for why they may or may not take their medications or their approach to it. So the example on the right is from the same study about women's perspectives of pregnancy and chronic kidney disease, where I developed some preliminary themes and sub-themes. And then I put them into the software. So I generally do this step after I've come up with my preliminary themes, because I find it quite difficult to change things around within the software. So it's a bit blurred out just to protect confidentiality. So on the lower left is the code book, the list of themes, and I pull out my transcripts on the right of the page, and then I start going through highlighting and coding the data into those codes that were inductively developed. And then I generate a report. So this report will produce the, say in this case, the sub-theme and all the text that I've coded under that sub-theme. Then I put this into a table where I have my theme on the left and all the quotations on the right. This is just, selected examples, but this table is usually quite long and comprehensive. Then I would proceed to expand and describe what I mean by the sub-theme in one paragraph that captures and condenses all the data that I've collected. So really describing all the perspectives there. And as a little tip, you may want to include an extra kind of column to highlight the key points to aid with writing up. So this is an example of a paragraph that I would write up. So in this sub-theme of conscious of their physical and medical frailty, and some tips in terms of writing from the participants' perspective. So it's always, the participants believed, they felt. I like to use some quotations, picking some kind of gold nugget quotations, those that are really compelling, where it conveys a point in a way that I couldn't sort of convey it any better. And it's sort of like icing on the cake. So I wouldn't use too many quotes throughout, but you use your standard prose, but embed some of those gold nugget quotations in there. And for me, I generally take that. Some people may disagree, but I do sometimes trim and edit quotes so that it actually makes sense for the reader, but it retains the intended meaning. Because of journal counts, a lot of the quotations, I always provide a table of quotations or supporting quotations for each of the sub-themes as a separate table. And to tag the quotation so people know that it's come from different participants. So by tagging, you could say, women in her 50s. You can add a couple of demographics in there. And as you're writing, also think about comparing. So you may note that some of the data was only from the younger population or a particular type of group, and you may want to add that in describing or when you're writing up the paragraph. So the second part on reporting qualitative data and demonstrating, how to demonstrate that you've followed a rigorous approach. So it's about convincing the reader of the merit and validity of the analysis, which also can be quite challenging because in a lot of the sort of clinical or medical journals, the reviewers and editors may be more familiar with quantitative methods where the kind of paradigm is quite different. With qualitative, reality is socially constructed by the individual. It involves a lot of interpretation and it's contextual. And reliability is really the consistency and trustworthiness of the findings, and validity, whether the method investigates what it sets out to investigate. Some of you may be familiar with the Equator network. So I've just put the website there, and this provides all the reporting checklists for all the different study designs, including for randomized trials, for systematic reviews, for observational studies, and also for qualitative studies. And Bethany, you mentioned earlier in the introduction about CORIC. So this is one that has been endorsed by the Equator network. It's a checklist specifically for interviews and focus groups, and it's really about making transparent the process and the findings of this type of qualitative study. And I've just put in a quick example of some of the items for reporting the analysis and findings. So things like reporting the number of people involved in the analysis, how the themes were derived, whether software was used. And this is just really about making things explicit. And I was explaining to Bethany before, I actually developed this as part of my PhD because as I was doing a systematic review of qualitative studies, I found that it was very difficult to work out what the researchers did because the reporting was really suboptimal, let's say. And when presenting the findings or the themes, so I generally use thematic analysis and present a set of themes and sub-themes in my work. Others may present their findings quite differently, but some general tips if using this approach: to ensure that you're conveying meaning. So developing that phrasal statement that is very rich in meaning so that it really sheds light on the values and beliefs of the participants. So what I've seen quite a lot is when I read a qualitative study, there might be themes such as, emotional impact, physical consequences, but it doesn't really tell me much about what the participants are feeling or thinking. So try and avoid those sorts of phrases, but really be quite specific, capturing their values and as much as possible also the context. Making each theme distinct, so avoiding overlapping concepts. And one tip may be to avoid using the same keywords across your themes and sub-themes. What I've also noticed is some people as themes, that they come up with suggestions for care, for example, a need for more education or help with navigating the health system. But instead, what I suggest is actually with the themes, focus on the reason and keep the suggestions for the discussion. So instead of more education, it might be more around feeling disempowered by lack of knowledge, or instead of help with navigating the health system, it might be that they're feeling bewildered and lost in the system, or kind of threatened and vulnerable. And as I mentioned before, adding the feeling and the context, capturing both aspects. I would say aim for 5 to 7 themes. That's kind of a general rule of thumb, with a few sub-themes to expand on each of those themes, because I think this is sort of a good number in terms of, for the readers, in terms of readability and being able to kind of digest all the information. And then focusing, really, qualitative research is really about trying to paint that full painting or that picture of the concepts that are coming up. We're not trying to assess frequency. So one tip may be to use, when describing, some participants felt, some participants believed, and trying to avoid quantification, like 2 out of 30 participants felt this way, because frequency is not a valid indicator of the percentage of agreement, because with interviews, sometimes you might chop and change the interview questions. So you're not asking them like as in a survey in exactly the same way all the time. And it's also not an indicator of importance. So for example, if one person felt a particular way, it doesn't make their experience or feeling less important than if, say, 10 people reported on it. Just a note here that appraising the conduct of qualitative research is really contentious because there's no empiric evidence to say, look, if someone used software, their qualitative research is of better quality. But there are some guides available. There's the CASP tool, or here I've put up the one from Cooper that was published in the BMJ, some key questions to ask when reading qualitative research studies. But I actually quite like the framework from Lincoln and Gruber. And these are the 4 constructs that I generally use. So credibility, dependability, transferability, and also confirmability. Credibility is about whether the findings can be trusted, acknowledging that, multiple realities exist. We're not trying to measure that kind of single objective reality that you may do for quantitative. And qualitative is about offering well-rounded, reliable, and sensible explanations based on the evidence or the data collected. How you can demonstrate this, some examples given in the green text. So in the qualitative report, to provide the question guide that you've used, to demonstrate that you've used purposive sampling. So this is where you've had some strategy in your sampling approach. For example, you might be trying to choose participants that have diverse demographic and clinical characteristics, so you can paint that kind of broader picture of the phenomenon you're looking at. Reporting on triangulation, and this could happen in multiple aspects. So this is, for example, having 2 or more people involved in the analysis, for example, or 2 or more methods used to triangulate the data collection. Next one is dependability. Is the process logical and auditable? Can we follow what the researcher has done? And here, just again, acknowledging that the interpretation that's involved in qualitative studies is intrinsic. It's very difficult to produce, very identical findings. The way I do a qualitative study will be very different to the way you might look at the data and come up with your findings. Ensuring that there's a coherent link across from methodology to methods to the data that you've collected and also the findings, and also being very clear about how you collected and analyzed the data so that you can demonstrate, say, to the reviewers and editors that you followed a rigorous and systematic approach. And a few reporting items to demonstrate this is to report that you recorded the data, that you didn't just sort of rely on the memory of the data collection, that it was transcribed, and the use of software. So the use of software, one advantage, I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages, is you can actually be very explicit and show your coding decisions clearly. So transferability is whether the findings are relevant to other settings. So the concepts and theories that you've developed are potentially relevant and have implications in other, whether it's healthcare contexts, other populations. How you can do this is, say, in the discussion section, to compare your findings with other studies that have been conducted in other settings, and to provide a thick description. And this is about describing in detail, say, the setting and the context of the study, and also the participant characteristics. Okay, and now, and the final one, confirmability, to demonstrate that your findings and interpretations are very much reflective of the data that you've collected. I remember speaking to an editor of a very prominent transplantation journal and sort of directly asking, because this journal didn't publish any qualitative studies at all, and sort of asking why that was the case. And he said, yeah, when they receive qualitative studies, they're not sure whether it's just sort of a product of the researcher's imagination or just driven by their own agenda. So this is quite a key one to try and demonstrate in studies, and that the findings really, I suppose, accurately reflects their perspectives. And you can do this by describing the process of whether you had investigator checking done, so involving, say, 2 or more investigators in the process, somebody else has read the transcripts, so they've reviewed the analysis and they can say, yes, this captures the whole range of the data collected. Another approach is member checking, where you might want to send out the preliminary findings to all the participants and ask them, does this reflect what has been said in, say, the interviews or focus groups? Is there anything else that you would like to add that you think might be important? And then integrating any feedback into the final analysis. And a key one is also to provide the raw data. As I mentioned before, the way I usually do this is to provide a table of quotations. So I might have, say, around 3 quotations supporting each of the sub-themes developed. And the third and final part of this session, just discussing ways to present qualitative data in a visual manner. And this could be qualitative data in the primary qualitative studies, in a systematic review of qualitative studies, or perhaps a mixed methods study, and how it links to the quantitative data that you have collected. So with all, or almost all, the qualitative studies that I'm involved in, I generally encourage generation of what I call a schema of the themes, to kind of summarize the themes that were identified, themes and sub-themes that were identified, as well as how they relate to each other. And just going through a couple of tips when developing this to keep the themes and sub-themes together, usually in kind of one text box. These are just some practical ways. Note any broader clusters of themes. So they might sort of have these high order themes that encapsulate some of the themes in the study. Which you may recall in the pregnancy one, I had that kind of decisional burden encapsulating a couple of themes related to that idea. There might be a central theme. So there was one study I conducted with young people with chronic kidney disease, and the central theme was kind of achieving a sense of normality. Drawing links, this might be sort of tensions or sort of pathways among the themes, and then writing a paragraph or a figure legend to explain the story of how the themes come together. And another tip, you can use PowerPoint to generate these schemas, or what I like to use is Canva. So if you Google Canva, that'll come up. It's a kind of a free online type of platform that you can use to generate some schemas that have different designs, different elements that you can put together. So just in concrete terms, you've seen this thematic schema. I'm not sure why it's appearing like that on the PowerPoint, but we'll go to the next one since you've seen this one already. This schema is from a study that was conducted with children and parents on communication and decision-making in pediatric chronic kidney disease. So this is these are findings from a focus group study. This is quite a good example because this thematic schema captures quite a number of things. So the themes that were identified, there are 4 of them you can see. So disempowered by knowledge imbalance, recognizing their own expertise, striving to assert their own priorities, and then managing the child's involvement in decision-making. And what the first author, Tylee, was able to do here is kind of map these themes onto a spectrum. So she identified that this followed a kind of trajectory from kind of gaining knowledge, recognizing own expertise, and over time feeling empowered to identify and assert priorities in decision making. So she identified that kind of time spectrum and depicted that at the top. Also with this study, because it involved both children and parents, she color coded it, where orange were the sub-themes that were about children's perspectives, about their parents and clinicians. The blue related to the parents' perspectives about their clinicians, and green the parents' perspectives about their children. So she was able to capture kind of quite a number of aspects in this thematic schema. And here, even on the right there, striving to assert own priorities, she identified some facilitators to this and also barriers, which are shown there in the kind of the plus for the facilitators and also the minus for the barriers. Barriers, for example, if the child's feeling overprotected and overruled or struggling to voice their own preferences. So that you can actually communicate additional information clearly using these sorts of schemas than you could if it's just text and tables. This is an example from a systematic review looking at patients' beliefs about taking statins for preventing cardiovascular disease. So it's estimated the adherence is around 50% for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease and 70%, so a little higher for secondary prevention at 2 years. And this is a study looking at some of the reasons why. And in this thematic schema, I'm not sure why I might just go back and see. Yeah. In this thematic schema, we found that the data, the themes could be kind of split in two. So there were 2 themes related to, or that facilitated the acceptance and the use of this medication. So participants talked about being confident in preventing cardiovascular disease and also being able to integrate and making it routine in their daily life. Then on the other side of things, reasons for not taking statins was the financial strain, being unable to afford the medications, medical distrust, for example, feeling skeptical about doctors overprescribing. Some questioned the utility of the medications, or taking medication signified that they were sick and ill, so they were reluctant to take it, and also the medications being a threat to their health. For example, experiencing debilitating side effects or believing that it might even be toxic to their body. So that's one example of how you might show perhaps facilitators and barriers to something and how it was all put together. This is one where I used Canva to develop this, looking at nephrologist perspectives on gender disparities in chronic kidney disease and dialysis. So I've got the kind of 6 themes there, and kind of running through these themes or considerations. These were not sort of separate themes, but just kind of other overarching issues that I noted that ran through the themes. So, for example, social norms, power, systemic patriarchy, and unconscious bias, kind of running through that. So that was just one example of one developed using the Canva platform, which looks a little bit different to PowerPoint. So that's quite a good one to play around with. So another tip is to translate the findings into actual implications, so making them actionable, especially if you're publishing in a clinical journal. So some feedback that I often also hear is that, these qualitative findings are really interesting, it's really insightful, but what am I supposed to do with them? So in a publication or in a paper, you can actually do this, say, in the form of a table. Just following on from that gender study that I showed with the thematic schema, from the themes, you may want to identify domains where action could be taken. So in this study, for example, empowerment in decision-making and self-management, and coming up with some specific suggestions for this. Financial support, patient awareness and education, communication. So here you can provide a table where it's really drawn from your themes. You can also, I usually put this in the discussion section of the manuscript, where it's maybe just purely based on the themes identified, or maybe also informed by other studies as well, where I might reference them in the footnote of the table. And this is usually quite helpful when publishing qualitative studies, when people can really see, well, what can I do to improve care or improve policy based on the qualitative work. This is just another example where some qualitative studies were done with patients looking at their perspectives on kidney biopsy and how we can improve that sort of process. And this was embedded into guidelines as well. And you may also want to demonstrate the impact of the qualitative findings. This was done in the context of developing clinical practice guidelines for the screening and management of infectious microorganisms, or preventing infection in hemodialysis units, where some patients and caregivers were involved in a workshop and it was analysed in a qualitative way. But in this article, we also presented how these themes that were identified actually impacted upon the development of the guidelines, and what, say, new guideline topics were developed. And now just a couple of examples of presenting data from mixed methods approaches. And these are taken from quite similar studies, where we conducted a nominal group technique, whereby to look at what outcomes were important for patients in the context of clinical trials. So in dialysis, say, we looked at trials that reported outcomes in patients receiving dialysis, and the most frequent outcomes reported were things like calcium phosphate, all the biochemical parameters. But here we wanted to sort of really change the paradigm with how trials are conducted and report outcomes that are important to patients. As part of this process, we conducted nominal group technique, where we got patients and families together in, say, a group of around 10, and we asked them to identify outcomes that were important to them, and also to provide the reasons as to why they were important. So this was a mixed method studies, where they, in the quantitative sense, they could rank the importance of the outcome. So we calculated an importance score, but we also, in the paper, presented the reasons for their prioritization. So here on the left top part, this is just a picture of the board of the outcomes that they generated. The graph is a little bit hard to see, but this is how we presented the quantitative numerical data, looking at the importance scores of the outcomes. So you can see the list of outcomes they identified and the importance score attached to them. The black bar shows all, so patients and caregivers, and we also split them by patients and caregivers or family members. So the top 10, just to provide some context this was done in peritoneal dialysis. So the most important was PD infection, then mortality, fatigue, flexibility with time, blood pressure, and so on. And we also identified themes because they discussed this in a focus group setting, why they prioritized the outcomes the way they did. And the themes he identified were thinking about the serious sort of cascading consequences on their overall health, being able to maintain their role in social functioning. You know, they thought some outcomes were beyond their control and own responsibility. They considered importance of outcomes based on their current and impending relevance, or those outcomes such as infection that required constant vigilance. And the arrows sort of show how they relate to the different outcome groups. So this depicts the themes as well as how they underpinned the prioritization of the outcomes. And there's a couple of ways that you could do this. This is another one done in glomerular disease where you've got the outcome groups in the blue circles and how the themes in orange relate to those outcomes. So it's quite similar to the first one. But the next one is also quite a clever one. This was work done in children. So we asked children and their parents to prioritize outcomes as well. And then that one's difficult to see. But this schema also shows that the top 10 outcomes for children, the top 10 outcomes for their family, their parents, and how the themes relate to that. And what this shows that, you know, children were tended to be focused on their kind of immediate situation, their kind of current short-term goals, whereas parents tended to have a more future or long-term focus on their health. So prioritizing things like their growth, their cardiovascular health, whereas children were more concerned about, you know, life participation, being able to play sport, managing their fatigue so they could go to school, be with their friends, for example. So those are just some kind of examples of visually displaying the data, qualitative data in primary systematic reviews or mixed method studies. And just to summarize, qualitative findings really need to reflect the full range and depth of the data collected and to be presented in a comprehensible, insightful, trustworthy, and an actionable way. And being able to demonstrate the credibility, dependability, transferability, and confirmability of the study. And this may increase the potential of qualitative evidence and being able to impact upon practice and policy. Thank you so much for listening. And I might just stop there and see if you have any questions. Okay, so how do you determine, I might just go to the chat box first. How do you determine the relationship between or among themes as they are presented in your thematic schema? So this is actually done in a conceptual way. It's even done at the stage where I develop my list of preliminary themes, and I'm already making a note of how some of the themes may relate to each other. So one theme might contribute to another theme, or there might be a more overarching concept where I can cluster the themes. So it's kind of done for me, quite early on in the process. You meant, how many studies was the statins? Oh, Ned, you can email me. I can send you the study because I can't quite remember at the top of my head how many studies were included in that particular systematic reviews. And from memory, the themes, in terms of, yes, there were some themes where there were quite a lot of studies that contributed to that theme, and some themes where maybe only 1 or 2 studies contributed to that theme. So it varied depending on the theme. The importance of software, yes. So, okay, so the software that I use is HyperResearch, which I showed in the presentation. And to be honest, it's quite easy to use because there's also a lot of online tutorials that you can watch. And all the software programs are very similar. So they help you, they allow you to, type in your codes. They allow you to bring up your transcript and to use the kind of highlighting function, and you put them into the codes. There may be more sophisticated aspects of the programs, but generally that's how I use HyperResearch. No, you can pretty much use any study. So our university also has a free software license for in vivo. So some people use that, but they all pretty much do a very similar thing. Hyper research, I think for student pricing, I'm not sure. I think it's 500 or 600 or so. I find that one quite easy to use and quite easy to pick up. Grade circle. That's a very interesting question. There's been some. I can hear. I might just stop this sharing. Might help with the connection. I think I can hear somebody ask a question. Am I right? Or Bethany, did you hear something as well?
I did.
I'm sorry. I think it was my internet.
That's better. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think I'm still having some trouble, so I apologize. I may just need to send it in the chat. With in vivo, I've had some trouble trying to collaborate with others using their collaboration infrastructure. And I was just wondering if hyper research was a little bit more amenable to that.
Depends on what you mean in terms of collaboration. So my general approach is to assign somebody to do the lead analysis. So they are the ones that develop the preliminary themes. They're the ones that do all the coding, because I don't usually have more than one kind of person actually do the physical coding. You can if you want, but then the additional people are really generally they're the ones that kind of have read the transcripts or were involved in the data collection, so they have some knowledge of what data has been collected. Then they review the preliminary findings, how it's been written up, how it's been coded. So it depends on what you mean by collaboration, but for the approach that I've taken, it doesn't really matter too much because it's only the one person that's doing that anyway. They can produce the report and somebody can review that. I haven't actually used the grade circle. This is around rating the certainty of the evidence of qualitative research. I'm not sure if they have updated it, but since the last time I looked at it, which is about a year or two ago, and I did find it a little bit challenging to use. I'm not sure if Ned wants to make further comments about that particular tool. Yeah, but otherwise I haven't used it myself. So, and the last time I had a look at it, I found some of the concepts kind of challenging to evaluate. Any other questions? I've also got my email on the title page. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to contact me. Yep. Used it in public health emergency prepare. No, yeah, I'd be interested to know, Ned, if you found it useful in your synthesis. What did you think of it? In the context of maybe were you developing recommendations or guidelines or? Yeah, it might be worth revisiting and having a look at the measure. Or the instrument. Yes, sometimes the themes could be standalone. It really depends on what comes up. Yes, it can be in a lone box. Great. Yes, thanks, Ned. That would be great.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jaure. That was really fascinating. I love to see all those really cool data visualizations. You mentioned the Canva tool as a software, which is not a qualitative tool. It's like an infographic data visualization type of tool.
No, not really. Canva
No?
is a very general platform. I mean, you can do things like wedding invitations on it. It's just, it does PowerPoint presentations, but what I usually do is find different elements to create the sort of figure. So yeah, you can have a play around with that and see. It's free in the sense you will have access to some of the basic designs, but if you want to upgrade, it gives you access to more designs. But no, it's not it's not specifically for infographics or anything like that. Yeah.
But you can use it for that. I mean, it's not
Definitely.
a qualitative software.
No, not specifically qualitative. It's used for anything and everything, really.
Yes, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think this was fantastic. We will be archiving this recording as we do with all of our presentations, and they'll be available on our Course Education website. Please do the evaluation. We really, really appreciate everyone giving us your feedback on these different seminar series and how they are meeting your needs. And so we will be done for the summer, and we'll reconvene in the fall with additional Accord seminar series, and we hope to see you there. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Jaure. It was wonderful to meet you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.